The Scottish Reformation was the process by which Scotland broke with the papacy and developed a predominantly Calvinist national kirk or church, which was strongly Presbyterian in its outlook. It was a part of the wider European Protestant Reformation. From the 1520s, the ideas of Martin Luther began to have influence in Scotland, with Lutheran literature circulating in the East Coast burghs. In 1525, Parliament banned their importation. In 1528, the nobleman Patrick Hamilton, who had been influenced by Lutheran theology while at the universities of Wittenberg and Marburg, became the first Protestant martyr in Scotland, and he was burned at the stake for heresy outside St. Salvator's College at St. Andrews. Hamilton's execution inspired more interest in the new ideas. The Archbishop of St. Andrews was warned against any further such public executions. After entering his personal reign in 1528, James V avoided pursuing the major structural and theological changes to the Church undertaken by Henry VIII in England. In exchange for his loyalty to Rome, he was able to appoint his many illegitimate children and favorites to office in the Church, particularly David Beaton, who became a cardinal in 1538, and Archbishop of St. Andrews in 1539. James increased crown revenues by heavily taxing the Church, taking £72,000 in 4 years. The results of such appointments and taxation undermined both the status and finances of the Church. The Church was also divided by jurisdictional disputes between Gavin Dunbar, Archbishop of Glasgow, and James Beaton, Archbishop of St. Andrews, until his death in 1539. As a result, in 1536, the first provincial church council, called since 1470, failed to achieve major reforms or a united front against heresy. After the execution of Patrick Hamilton, the Crown prosecuted some men, and a small number of executions followed in the 1530s and 1540s, but there was no systematic persecution, as the king was not interested in wide-scale bloodletting. An increasing number of lairds and nobles began to favor reform. In 1541, Parliament passed legislation to protect the honor of the Mass, prayer to the Virgin Mary, images of the saints, and the authority of the Pope. James V died in 1542, leaving the infant Mary Queen of Scots as his heir, with the prospect of a long minority. At the beginning of Mary's reign, the Scottish political nation was divided between a pro-French faction, led by Cardinal Beaton and by the Queen's mother, Mary of Guise, and a pro-English faction headed by Mary's prospective heir, James Hamilton, Earl of Arran. Initially, Arran became regent, backed by the small evangelical party at court, who favored religious reform. The Parliamentary Act of 1543 removed the prohibition against reading the Bible in the vernacular. A planned marriage between Mary and Edward, the son of Henry VIII of England, which had been agreed under the Treaty of Greenwich in 1543, led to a backlash in Scotland and a coup led by Cardinal Beaton. He repudiated the Protestant policies and all consideration of an English marriage for the Queen, which angered the English. They invaded in order to enforce the match, an action later known as the Rough Wooing, which devastated southeast Scotland. In 1546, George Wishart, a preacher who had come under the influence of Swiss reformer Huldrych Zwingli, was arrested and burnt at the stake in St. Andrews on the orders of Cardinal Beaton. Wishart's supporters, who included a number of Fife lairds, assassinated Beaton soon after and seized St. Andrews Castle, which they held for a year while under siege, before they were defeated with the help of French forces. The survivors, including chaplain John Knox, were condemned to be galley slaves, helping to create resentment of the French and martyrs for the Protestant cause. In 1547, the English, under Edward Seymour, 1st Duke of Somerset, renewed their invasion and defeated the Scots at Pinkie, occupied southeast Scotland with forts at Lauder, Haddington, and an outpost at Dundee. The occupation between 1547 to 1549 encouraged the Protestant cause. The English supplied books and distributed Bibles and Protestant literature in the lowlands. Several earls pledged themselves to cause the word of God to be taught and preached. To counter the English, the Scots secured French help, the price of which was the betrothal of the infant queen to the French Dauphin, the future Francis II, and she left to go to France in 1548, where she was to be raised and educated. French ascendancy was made absolute over the next decade. In 1554, Arran was given the title Duc du Châtellerault and removed from the regency in favor of Mary of Guise. During her regency from 1554 to 1560, the Queen's mother ensured the predominance of France in Scottish affairs. She put Frenchmen in charge of the treasury and the Great Seal, and the French ambassador Henri Clotin sometimes attended the Privy Council. At first, Mary of Guise cultivated a policy of limited toleration of Protestants, hoping to gain their support for her pro-French policies and against England, which from 1553 was under the rule of the Roman Catholic Mary Tudor, who married the future Philip II of Spain in 1554. Hopes for reform of the existing church helped keep the political nation unified, but the marriage of Mary Queen of Scots to the Dauphin in 1558 heightened fears that Scotland would become a French province. And Protestants were given hope by the accession in England of the Protestant Queen Elizabeth in 1558, which created a frontier in Great Britain. The Roman Catholic Church responded to some of the criticisms being made against it. John Hamilton, Archbishop of St. Andrews, instigated a series of provincial councils, modeled on the contemporaneous Council of Trent. In 1548, attempts were made to eliminate concubinage, clerical pluralism, clerical trading, and non-residence, and to prohibit unqualified people from holding church offices. Further, the clergy were enjoined to scriptural reflection, and bishops and parsons instructed to preach at least 4 times a year. Monks were to be sent to university, and theologians appointed for each monastery, college, and cathedral. But in 1552, it was acknowledged that little had been accomplished. Attendance at Mass was still rare. Protestantism, meanwhile, continued to expand in this period and became more distinct from those who wanted reform within the existing church. Protestants began to develop a series of privy kirks, or secret churches, whose members increasingly turned away from the existing church structures. Their organization was sufficient in 1555 for Knox to return to Scotland. He administered a Protestant communion and carried out a preaching tour of the privy kirks. He urged the members to reject Nicodemism, by which they held Protestant convictions but attended Roman Catholic services. Despite being offered protection by the Earl of Argyll, he returned to Geneva in 1556. In the absence of a leading clerical figure, the leadership of the movement was taken by the few nobles who had embraced Protestantism, and a new generation that included Argyll's son, Lord Lorne, the illegitimate son of the late King James V, Lord James Stuart, and Lord John Erskine. 1st of January, the anonymous beggar's summons was posted on the doors of friaries, threatening friars with eviction on the grounds that their property belonged to the genuine poor. This was calculated to appeal to the passions of the populace of towns who appeared to have particular complaints against friars. Knox returned to Scotland and preached at the Church of St. John the Baptist at Perth on the 11th of May on Christ cleansing the temple. The congregation responded by stripping the shrines, images, and altars of the church, and then sacked the local friaries and a Carthusian house. The regent responded by sending troops to restore order, and Glencairn led a force to defend the town's new Protestant status. A royal delegation, including Argyll and James Stuart, persuaded the burgh to open its gates, but the heavy-handed treatment by the regent's forces led to a breakdown in negotiations. Argyll and Stuart changed sides, and the lords of the congregation now began raising their followers for an armed conflict. A series of local reformations followed, with Protestant minorities gaining control of various regions and burghs, often with the support of local lairds and using intimidation, while avoiding the creation of Roman Catholic martyrs, to carry out a cleansing of friaries and churches, followed by the appointment of Protestant preachers. Such reformations occurred in conservative Aberdeen and the ecclesiastical capital of St. Andrews, together with other eastern ports. In June, Mary of Guise responded by dispatching a French army to St. Andrews to restore control, but it was stopped by superior numbers at Coupar-Muir and forced to retreat. Edinburgh fell to the Lords in July, and Mary moved her base to Dunbar. However, the arrival of French reinforcements of 1,800 men forced the Lords onto the defensive, and they abandoned the capital. The Lords appealed for help from England and Mary from France. English agents managed the safe return of the Earl of Arran, the eldest son and heir of Châtellerault, allowing him to accept the leadership of the Lords. In October, the regent was declared suspended and replaced by a Great Council of the realm. However, Mary of Guise's forces continued to advance, once again threatening St. Andrews. The situation was transformed by the arrival of the English fleet in the Firth of Forth in January 1560, and the French retreated to the stronghold of Leith near Edinburgh. The English and the Lords agreed to further support by the Treaty of Berwick in February 1560, and an English army crossed the border to lay siege to the French in Leith. Mary of Guise fell ill and died in June. With no sign of reinforcements, the French opened negotiations. Under the Treaty of Edinburgh, both the English and French removed their troops from Scotland, leaving the Protestant lords in control of the country. The lords accepted Mary Queen of Scots and her husband, now Francis II of France, as monarchs, and were given permission to hold a parliament, although it was not to touch the issue of religion. The Scottish Parliament met in Edinburgh on the 1st of August 1560, and ignoring the provisions of the Treaty of Edinburgh, on the 17th the Parliament approved a reformed Confession of Faith, and on the 24th of August it passed 3 acts that abolished Roman Catholicism in Scotland. Under these, all previous acts not in conformity with the Reformed confession were annulled. The sacraments were reduced to two, baptism and communion, to be performed by Reformed preachers alone. The celebration of the Mass was made punishable by a series of penalties, and papal jurisdiction in Scotland was repudiated. The Queen declined to endorse the acts that Parliament had passed, and the new Kirk existed in a state of legal uncertainty. The Lords had intended Parliament to consider a Book of Reformation, which they had commissioned and was largely the works of Knox. However, they were unhappy with the document and established a committee of 6 Johns, including John Knox, John Wyndham, John Spottiswoode, John Willock, John Douglas, and John Rowe, to produce a revised version. The result of the delay was that the document, known as the First Book of Discipline, was considered not by the full Parliament, but only by a thinly attended convention of nobles and about 30 lairds, in January 1561, and then only approved individually. The book promised a program of parish-based reformation that would use the resources of the old Roman Catholic Church to pay for a network of ministers, a parish-based school system, university education, and poor relief. However, this proposal for the use of church wealth was rejected. Instead, an Act of Council kept 2/3 of the Roman Catholic Church's assets in the hands of its existing holders, while the remaining third was divided between the Crown and the reformist measure. The educational program was abandoned, ministers remained poorly paid, and the church was underfunded. The Scots Confession was produced by Knox and 5 colleagues in just 4 days. Its structure parallels that of the Apostles' Creed, with 25 chapters based around the themes of the Father, Son, Church, and Consummation. It remained the standard of the Kirk until it was replaced by the Westminster Confession, negotiated with English parliamentary allies during the English Civil War, and adopted by the Kirk in 1647. The Confession was very strongly Calvinist in tone and emphasized the inscrutable providence of God who had determined all things, and stressed the extreme depravity of mankind who deserved eternal damnation and the mercy of God in selecting a portion of humanity for salvation through grace alone. It denied transubstantiation but retained the real presence in the Eucharist. It largely avoided negative condemnations of Roman Catholicism, focusing on setting out the new faith in simple language. In 1581, as part of a reaction to the perceived threat of Roman Catholicism, the court signed a King's or negative confession, probably commissioned by James VI, that much more harshly denounced Roman Catholicism. The Reformation saw a complete transformation of religious observance. In the place of the many holy days and festivals of the Roman Catholic Church and the occasional observance of the Mass, the single surviving holy day was Sunday, and regular attendance and participation was required of the people. Latin was abandoned in favor of the local language. Congregational psalm singing replaced the elaborate polyphony of trained choirs. An emphasis was put on the Bible and the sermon, which is often longer than an hour, although many parishes which had no minister would have only a reader service of psalms, prayers, and Bible readings. The Geneva Bible was widely adopted. Protestant preachers fleeing Marian persecutions in England had brought with them Edward VI's Second Book of Common Prayer, which was commanded by the lords of the congregation. Knox too initially supported it. However, before leaving Geneva and with the encouragement of Calvin, he had written his own Book of Common Order, and it was this that was printed and approved by the General Assembly of 1562. Enlarged, it was reprinted with a confession and the Psalms in meter in 1564, and it remained the standard until it was replaced by the Westminster Directory in 1643. A Gaelic translation of the Book of Common Order was produced in 1563, which was the very first book printed in Gaelic, but there would be no Gaelic Bible until the 18th century. The first Book of Discipline envisioned the establishment of reformed ministers in each of the approximately 1,080 parishes. By 1574, there were just over 1,000. These were mainly concentrated in the south of East. In the Highlands, there were shortages, and very few spoke the Gaelic of the local population. The universities were unable to supply sufficient trained ministers over a generation, and many, over 3/4 in 1574, were holders of the junior post of readers rather than qualified ministers. The bulk of these were former Roman Catholic clergy. The untidy system of 13 medieval dioceses was to be replaced by 10 more rational districts, each to be overseen by a superintendent. This plan was complicated by the conversion of 3 bishops to Protestantism, who were allowed to remain in their posts. Few superintendents were appointed, and temporary commissioners were nominated to fill the gaps. In 1576, when the General Assembly considered the structure of the Kirk, it recognizes 5 offices: archbishops, bishops, superintendents, commissioners, and visitors. Beside these posts was a system of church corps